Well, good afternoon and welcome to this week's Calder Valley constituency update. As everybody will have seen this week, we've had the Prime Minister announce further restrictions, easing of restrictions on the lockdown, and they start from next week. I hope people are going out and using our local shops that are taking the time to open from last week. I think I mentioned last week that I was down in Tomberton, and our butchers and food stall holders at the market were telling me that lots of people are going back into local markets to buy the produce and the food, which is good stuff, and that's good to see. We just need to see more of that and help support our local business people. As we know, from next week, we start to see a further easing of lockdown from the 4th of July. Pubs, yes, restaurants, and of course, hairdressers. So no offense to Mrs. W, but it'd be nice to go and get a proper haircut again. So that's all from next week. So without further ado, here are the questions that we've had in so far. And of course, like every week, if you want to pop in a question on the live feed here, more than happy if we get time to answer some of those as well. So the first question this week comes from Pat, and Pat asks, I would like to know what further steps you will be taking to ensure that our commitments to underdeveloped communities will be fulfilled in light of the government's proposed merger of DFID with the Foreign Office. Well, thanks, Pat. For those of you that don't know, the Prime Minister announced last week that the Department for DFID, which is Department for International Development, is being abolished, and the function of that is going to go with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And as we already know, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, will be head of that new, bigger department. But what Pat is asking, of course, is how do we make sure that we continue with our commitments to underdeveloped communities with those? Well, the thing, Pat, is first of all, we already have in legislation that we have to, by law, spend 0.7% of our GDP on international aid, and we have been one of the very few countries in the world that signed up to that commitment in the 1950s, and we are one of the few that is actually hitting that and have been hitting it now for several years. That was something that came in when David Cameron was our Prime Minister. But there is a bigger issue here than the merger with DFID and the FCO, and it's a question I asked in the House some weeks ago now, and that is around the light of the current recession because of the pandemic and the economy being closed, means that our GDP will be significantly less than it has been. And if we are going to spend 0.7% of our GDP, then that will be significantly less than it was last year, for example. So my concern is how do we balance it so that we don't see countries or projects in other countries being curtailed because obviously there's less money there. And whilst we haven't got a definitive answer yet from ministers, I do know that's one of the areas that they are looking very closely at doing to make sure that projects that we've started and have committed to overseas don't get shelved or pulled halfway through because our GDP has taken a big hit. So Pat, I hope that answers your first question or the question. Tom, and I've already mentioned pubs open on July the 4th. So Tom asks, how can small pubs hope to survive if they are limited in the number of people they can have inside while still implementing social distancing measures? That's a really good question, Tom, because I do worry about our pubs, particularly the smaller ones. But there's two key things that have happened. First of all, whilst the 2 meter rule stays, we can go down to, in areas where we can't, of 1 meter plus, as the Prime Minister says. So basically, in areas where you can't have a 2 meter social distancing, then by all means you can go down to a meter. But obviously, if you can do 2 meters, that's just as important. Um, but specifically to answer your question, Tom, you will have seen, or you may not have seen, that the Prime Minister is introducing a bill next week, I think, to make sure that pubs and restaurants can take up space in the street, or out front, so that we can get more diners, more people to drink in areas where it's safe to do so. So taking over payments, taking over courtyards, and all those types of things. So is it going to be tough? Of course, Tom, it is going to be tough, particularly if you're in a pub or a publican of one of those pubs where you don't have additional space where you can move out onto the pavement. But that's one of the things that the government are doing to try and make it a little bit easier for those pubs and restaurants. Here's a good one from Clara. Clara obviously took note of the Opposition Day motion last week, which was asking the government to test everybody in the NHS, test as in COVID-19 testing, which was defeated by the government. And I was one of the people that voted against it. And let me tell you why I voted against it, regular testing of the NHS staff. Actually, because we already do it. We already do the regular testing. So if there are people in the NHS that have got symptoms, they get tested. And similarly, they get to have the other test, which determines whether they've actually had it. The NHS, ironically, a lot of people in the NHS don't work frontline. So the motion would have made it that people who work in offices, administrators, people that don't have frontline connection with patients. There's a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, a lot of consultants that are currently, there's two parts to the NHS currently. There's those that are dealing with COVID and those that are dealing with other emergencies. They don't have the need, and the scientific evidence and advice very much is about testing those frontline staff that are in direct contact with patients with COVID. So we do that, and the scientific evidence is very clearly saying that to test everybody would be an absolute nonsense. So that's why we voted against that motion on Tuesday. So the right thing to do, let's carry on keeping focused, let's testing those that need testing, and making sure that we can drive down the infection rate on the pandemic. Okay, I've got a couple more that have been emailed in, but let me just have, let's just, Antoinette Barker says, our country is verging on being underdeveloped. There is an awful lot of poverty. Isn't it time we put our own first before giving large amounts of monies to the rest of the world? Antoinette, what a load of nonsense. We are not on the verge of being underdeveloped. If you've ever been to an underdeveloped country, you will understand why I've just said what I've said. There is an awful lot of poverty. Well, believe it or not, our actual poverty is decreasing year on year on year. And relative poverty, of course, that is relative to the wealth of everybody else. So no, I don't agree with that. But I get what you're trying to say there, Antoinette, about giving large amounts of monies to the rest of the world, particularly when we're in this middle of this pandemic. it's going to cost this country an awful lot of money, but we are a wealthy country. But so it is important that what we do is we continue those education programs, those health programs that we carry on in underdeveloped countries, and indeed in areas where there is natural disaster as well, where those countries really do rely on us for help. So that was from Antoinette. I know it's not agreeing with your sentiments there, Antoinette, but that is the answer. Chantel asks, "Hi Craig, can you tell me what the new air bridges are and how they will operate?" Well, good question, because I was one of the MPs that didn't particularly agree with imposing the self-isolation for those coming back or into this country, as has just been imposed, because I can't understand why we're doing it now and why we didn't do it at the start, like countries like Australia, like New Zealand. But we are where we are. The air bridges basically are countries that have reduced the R value in line with us, so as not a higher risk than the UK is in regards to the reinfection rate. So, for example, Spain is currently being talked about an air bridge, so you can travel to Spain and not have to. Well, no, actually, this isn't the case. It hasn't been announced yet. I'm using this as an example. Say Spain was one of the countries. You can travel to Spain and back without having to self-isolate, because the risk is the same as it is here or lower than what it is here. Portugal currently has a higher rate, so you probably would find a country. I mean, again, don't quote me. This is me using this as an example. Portugal has a higher R rate, so probably wouldn't be an air bridge, as you say. So watch this space in the next couple of weeks. I do know the Home Secretary or the Transport Secretary is about to make an announcement. I think it's next week on air bridges and the current status of our own self-isolation period if you are coming back into the UK. So watch this space for some announcements. But in a nutshell, that's what it is. In countries that have a similar infection rate to us or a lower infection rate to us, we can travel freely. Those that are higher than us and have a higher risk than us, you won't be able to do this. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what an air bridge is. I hope that explains what they are a little bit better. Right, Richard Langford. Hello, Richard. I notice Richard's a regular on here. Hi, Craig. Will you be attending and getting down on one knee at the Black Lives Matters gathering in Halifax tomorrow? Richard, the answer, quite simply, to your question is no. I won't be attending the BLM gathering in Halifax tomorrow at all. What I will say to you, though, is that in regards to Black Lives Matters, of course, Black lives do matter, as do all other lives in our community. So, totally respect what the movement are doing in highlighting the plight, what happened in America and what can happen in other countries, ours included as well. But what I don't agree with in Black Lives Matters, of course, is one of their aims is to take money away from our police forces and defunding of the police. So I don't agree with that element of Black Lives Matters at all. So Richard, I hope that answers your question. That yes, Black lives do matter without question. What happened in America was appalling and should never go unchallenged. But what I don't do is what I don't agree with is the aims and objectives of the group, which is ironically, taking money away from the very police that are there to protect them when they're when they're uh, protesting. Uh, right, Roger Drayton. Oh, good old Roger, our socialist friend, is back with us. How are you doing, Roger? How do you explain the difference between the UK excess death stats of 65,000, ONS figure of 55,000 COVID deaths, and the government 43,000 deaths, even using the 43,000 the highest? Right, okay. Okay, Roger, there are several points to this. The first thing that I would say to you is that we are the only country in the world that records three things on a death certificate. First of all, the death. So if I'm in a car accident, for example, obviously it's going to be multiple injuries. If I had a disease or something, as well as that, say, I don't know, I'm being incredibly dark and dooming and gloomy here, but just say I had cancer at the same time, they would put both things on there because we put probable cause, actual cause, probable cause, and any other circumstances on the death certificate. So that's the first thing. We're the only country in the world that does that. So in regards to COVID, unless you physically test to see whether I have COVID, and as we know, in the start of the pandemic process, there was a lot of deaths that weren't tested. However, because of the pandemic, doctors and registrars quite often put it down as probably COVID. So, but we record that as a COVID death. You don't see that happening in any other country in the world. So that's the first thing that I would say to you. Excess deaths, interestingly enough, Roger, there is a real discussion going on presently, and it's a question that I asked our health officials last week, is because there are quite a lot of areas now where we have a negative excess death on the previous year. Some people say that may be because some of the vulnerable people who were recorded or who physically died of COVID at the start of the pandemic um, would have probably, and I say probably because this is a view, died anyway. So that may account. That on top of the fact that, of course, we haven't been using our cars as much, so we haven't had as many car accidents and all those types of things. So we're now in quite a few places throughout the UK, and we're pretty close in Calderdale. Bearing in mind we're 2 weeks behind the south, where actually our excess deaths are now below what they were last year. You wouldn't, of course, start saying, well, okay, we've had 10 die of COVID, but we're 9 below what we were last year, so we've only had 1 COVID. That's not how the system works. But there is multiple things and reasons in there, Roger. Uh, 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 he's come back and said, I'm puzzled by your socialist reference. I'm not a Labour Party supporter, but I do analyse, study, and what I am being told. Okay, fair enough. Okay, let's move on to Vinny. Vinny asks, why can pubs and bars open, but gyms and swimming pools can't? Well, the scientific evidence around indoor gyms, outdoor gyms are allowed, but indoor gyms aren't. Similarly, swimming pools where you have a very enclosed space and controlled temperatures, the scientific advice is that the risk in those areas is much, much higher at contamination or contracting the virus anyway. So that's why gyms and swimming pools can't. As I've said in regards to pubs and restaurants, we are passing this legislation next week where pubs and restaurants can spill out further into the road, into the into the pavement, into courtyards, all those types of things. Um, so that's the real reason why. But the Prime Minister has said very clearly that we will continue to monitor, and things like that will be evaluated, and we will see more announcements on those areas of society that haven't reopened fairly soon, and particularly when the scientific evidence says that it is safe to do so. Right, I think we've got just one final question here. Richard, come back. Do you have any advice for people considering attending any gathering of more than 6 people? Well, just make sure that you are self-isolating if you feel as though you're unwell, you've been in an area, whether it's a protest or what have you, and you feel as though you can't, then don't put yourself in that health risk. But just make sure you're social distancing. And if you can't social distance, don't put yourself at risk. There is still a real danger and a real risk out there of contracting COVID and potentially becoming very poorly and even dying. So why would you put yourself in that situation when there's absolutely no need to do so? Of course, you know, the guidelines that have been issued are guidelines. People generally, I think, do the right thing. But, you know, this pandemic is not going away. It is still very real. And it is incumbent on us all to make sure that we are doing the right thing, not just for our own health, but for the people we live with, for the people that we work with, and for our friends and family. So do the right thing. If you're putting yourself at risk, take yourself out of the risk scenario. Okay, yeah, noted, Roger. Antoinette's come back. Pubs and restaurants able to open. Why not swimming pools and nail bars? Well, we've just covered that one with Vinny's question, Antoinette, and that is basically, you're absolutely right. These places are cleaned constantly, and particularly swimming pools are incredibly clean, but they are very much a controlled temperature, and we know that the virus is easy to catch in those closed spaces, and particularly when you're sweating or whatever, then you know the transmission is much higher. So that's where we are. Okay, I think that's all we've got for today, which is fairly straightforward. Let me see if there's any I've missed. No, I think that's everybody online. That's everybody who's emailed in. So thank you very much again for coming in on the live Q&A session. But by all means, we're going to carry on doing this indefinitely at 4 o'clock on a Friday. But just double check on my Facebook page. Sophie will put an advert on there just in case there is a week when I can't do 4 o'clock. But generally, it will be 4 o'clock on a Friday. You can either put some questions on the Facebook page where we advertise it. You can email my office, or indeed, if you're free on a Friday afternoon and to watch the live broadcast, then like Richard, Antoinette, and Roger have done today, you're very welcome to submit questions. I believe it's going to the forecast is showery over the weekend, which might be a welcome relief from this incredibly muggy, hot temperature today. But whatever you're doing, stay safe, enjoy the weekend, and make sure you're thinking not just about yourself, but your whole friends and family when you're dealing with the virus. Thank you. Have a good weekend.